Hello dear learners, I Dr. Nilakshi Arora, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce, the Bhopal School of Social Sciences is here to talk about a topic of corporate accounting, which is valuation of shares if preference shares are given in a particular question. So before moving forward to the valuation of a preference share, let us discuss what exactly is preference share. So preference share is a share which have got preferential right for payment of dividend as well as for repayment of capital in case of winding up of company. You might also have seen in the balance sheet 6% preference share, 8% preference share. So that 8% denotes that the preference share has a fixed rate of dividend which is 6 or 8%. This is not with the equity share. Equity shares do not have fixed rate of dividend, they have a flexible rate of dividend. In case of winding up also, in case the repayment has to be done of capital, preference share will be paid first, they will be given priority over the equity shares. You also might be aware that a company cannot issue irredeemable preference share. A preference share shall have a maximum life of 20 years. You also might be knowing that in case of preference share, there is a class which is cumulative preference share and non-cumulative preference share. Cumulative preference share basically means those kinds of preference share in which if a dividend is not being paid for 1 year, it shall be cumulated and paid for in the next year. In case of non-cumulative preference share, the preference share dividend is not accumulated. If in 1 year company is able to pay the amount of dividend, it is going to pay. If it is not able to pay the dividend to those preference share, it will not be paid in the next year. All these points which I have discussed right now about preference share are important while we solve the question for valuation of a preference share. So whenever you get a question of valuation of preference share, there are basically 4 situations which you are going to get, which is the priority and the non-priority. So the first one is if preference shares have no priority for payment of capital and dividend. If preference share have no priority for payment of capital and dividend, it means preference share are treated at par with the equity shares. So whenever company is going to wind up or whenever the amount has to be given to equity and preference, they will be given at same point of time. So there is no priority in payment. That means equity and preference are treated as same. The next situation is where preference shares have priority only for the repayment of capital. So the priority is only for the amount of capital which has to be paid to preference shareholder. There is no priority for payment of dividend. Priority is only for the payment of capital amount. The next situation is when you have priority only for the payment of dividend. So when the amount has to be paid out of net assets, the amount of dividend on preference share shall be paid first, and then you are going to pay the amount of to equity as well as preference shareholders. Next one is when there is priority for the payment of capital as well as dividend. So in this case, priority is given in both the cases. So you have to understand from here that there are possible 4 situations. First one is no priority, second one is priority for capital, third one is priority only for dividend, and the fourth one is when priority is for capital as well as dividend. So let us understand each situation by the formula and an example. The first situation is when preference shares have no priority for payment of capital and dividend. If there is no priority for payment of dividend and capital, that means it is treated as par with the equity shareholders. So how you are going to value the preference share? So the simple formula is value of a share is equal to net assets divided by number of equity plus number of preference shares. You all are aware what is net assets. We have already discussed this in our previous module. Net assets simply means market value of all realizable assets less the value of external liabilities. So once we have calculated the net assets, from that net assets we are going to divide the number of equity and we are going to divide the number of preference shares. So in this example, we have been given net assets as 5 lakh. We have 1000 equity shares of rupees 10. We have 2006% preference shares of rupees 10. This 6% denotes the rate of dividend. and the dividend is in arrear for 2 years, calculate the price of equity and preference share if there is no priority for repayment of capital and dividend. So, simply what you are going to do, you are going to take net assets which is 5 lakh rupees. This 5 lakh you are going to divide with the number of equity and preference. The number of equity and preference is 3000. So, 5 lakh divided by 3000, the value of every share is 166.67. So, this is the value of every equity share as well as this is the value of every preference share. Moving to the next situation, if preference shares have priority for payment of capital as well as dividend. If there is a priority, that means the repayment of capital and dividend is treated as a liability. Whatever are the net assets which are available with the company, first you are going to pay the amount of preference share capital as well as their dividend, and then the amount which is left will be paid to the equity shareholders. So, in this case the formula will be value of equity share is net assets which you have calculated using market value of realizable assets less the external liabilities minus the preference share capital minus arrears of dividend divided by number of equity shares, because preference share capital as well as dividend is treated as external liability. So, once it is treated as external liability, what you are going to do? You will be subtracting both of them from the net assets. Now, children, this preference share capital and this dividend belongs to preference shareholders. So, while calculating the value of one preference shareholder, the formula will be preference share capital, this preference share capital plus this arrears of dividend divided by the number of preference shareholders. Let us understand this situation also with the help of an example. So, I will take the previous example only. The value of net assets is 5 lakh rupees, 1000 equity shares of rupees 10 each, 2006% preference shares of rupees 10 each. Dividend is in arrear for 2 years. You are required to calculate the price if there is priority for repayment of capital as well as dividend. So, let us first calculate the amount of dividend. So, value is rupees 20,000 preference share. So, 20,000 into 6% will give you dividend for 1 year. It is in arrear for 2 years. So, multiplied by 2 will give you dividend for 2 years. So, I have calculated here dividend in arrears is rupees 2400. So, now we will calculate the value of equity shares, and how we are going to do it? Value of a equity share is net assets which is 5 lakh rupees minus the value of preference dividend which is 2400 minus preference share capital 20,000 divided by number of equity shares which is 1000. So, you will get the value of every equity share as 477.60. Now, while calculating the value of preference share, what you are going to do? You will add preference share capital plus the arrears. So, 20,000 plus 2400 divided by 2000 will give you 11 rupees 20 paisa as the value of every preference share. Coming to the third situation, when the preference share has priority only for the payment of capital. So, in this case what will be done? You will take value of equity share as net assets minus the preference share capital. Here dividend will not be subtracted because dividend have no priority. The priority is only for the repayment of capital. So, you are going to subtract only the amount of capital. So, value of equity share will be net assets minus preference share capital divided by number of equity shares. The next one is how will you calculate the value of preference share? So, this preference share capital divided by the number of preference share will give you the value of one preference share. So, let us understand this also with the help of an example. We already know the value of net assets is 5 lakh, value of equity is 10,000, value of preference is 20,000. So, how will you calculate? This time dividend in arrears will be 0 because dividend do not have a priority. The priority is only for the payment of capital. So, value of equity share will be net assets minus the amount of preference share capital which is 20,000 divided by the number of equity shares which is 1000. So, every equity share is of rupees 480, and for preference share what you are going to do? Amount of preference share capital divided by number of preference share which is 20,000 divided by 2000 which is rupees 10. Technically, if you look into the question also, every preference share is of rupees 10 only because we are not giving any priority. So, when you solve a question in this situation, preference share value will always be equal to the paid up value of particular preference share. So if here 10 is given, you will get the value of preference share as 10 only, because you are subtracting 20,000 exact amount. Moving to the last situation that we have, if preference shares have priority only for the payment of dividend, that means the payment of dividend is treated as an external liability. So how will you calculate? This time you will not calculate the value of equity, you will calculate the value of a share first, because capital of equity and capital of preference is treated as par. It is just the situation that the dividend of preference share will be paid in addition to them. So what you are going to do is, you will calculate value of share as net assets minus preference share dividend divided by number of equity plus preference shares. Then the value of equity will be equivalent to this value of share, whereas for value of preference share you are going to add value of share plus this dividend also belongs to preference share. So this dividend will also be calculated. So this dividend you are going to calculate using a formula which is total dividend divided by number of preference shareholder. You will understand this better when we move forward to the example. So let us understand this situation also with the help of example. In case preference shares have priority only for payment of dividend, this dividend will be treated as an external liability. So that means from the amount of net assets you are going to subtract preference share dividend, and then you are going to divide it with the number of equity and preference shares. So we all know the dividend is rupees 2400. So from the net assets of 5 lakh, I am going to subtract the dividend. This is treated as a liability. Then I am going to divide this with the number of equity plus preference shares, which is 3000. So I am going to get value of every share as 165.87. This is the value of every equity share. Now coming back to the question, this 2400 also belongs to preference shareholders. So that means along with this 165.87, they are liable to get 2400. Now this 2400 belongs to 2000 preference shareholders. That means every preference shareholder is going to get 1.20. Every preference share is going to get 1.20. So this 1.20 I am going to add to 165.87. So I will get the value of preference share as 167.07. So this is how you are going to solve the situation in which you get a question in which priority is given for the payment of dividend. Let us sum up everything now. So if preference shares have no priority at all, then what will you do? The value of every share will be net assets divided by number of equity plus preference shares, because everybody is treated as at par. If preference shares have priority for payment of capital as well as dividend, then what you are going to do? From the net assets you are going to subtract preference share capital as well as preference share dividend, and then you are going to divide it with the number of equity shares. And then how will you calculate the value of preference share? It will be preference share capital plus the dividend divided by number of preference shares. In case priority is only for the payment of capital, what will be done? From the net assets, preference share capital will be subtracted and it will be divided with the number of equity shares. And then for the preference share amount, what you are going to do? The preference share capital divided by number of preference shares. If the priority is for the dividend, then what you are going to do? You will calculate value of one share, which will be net assets minus the dividend divided by number of equity plus the preference shares. And then for calculating the value of a preference share, you will add the value of share calculated plus you are going to add the amount of dividend per share. So I hope you have understood the valuation of preference share. Happy learning. Thank you.